Welcome back to Bayou Sports Talk here on Oldie 640 KTIB. I'm your host, William Taylor, and the other night I had the deep pleasure of speaking to Jim Finks Jr., who, of course, is the son of Jim Finks, the former Saints general manager who passed away in 1994. I talked to the young Mr. Finks about a brand new book on his father's life, and first thing he wanted to talk about is how fun things were in New Orleans when he came down to visit his mom and dad.
Well, you know, I never lived in New Orleans, but I probably spent a year there as many times as I visited, going through and going to the games or going out to dinner at the Commander's Palace, just having a great time and met a lot of great people.
Yeah, well, okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll start off, and like I said, we're talking about your father and his life and times, and the new book for all the listeners is titled It's Been a Pleasure, the Jim Finks Story, and kind of tell us, Mr. Finks Jr., how did the book idea first come out?
Well, I talked to Dad about this back in 91, which was the second to last year that he was general manager in New Orleans for the Saints. And he really didn't have a lot of enthusiasm for it. His thing was, well, if you're going to write a book, you've got to bring in lawyers and you've got to have controversy and all that. And I didn't want to go that route. I think he had a pretty unique career in football, and it wouldn't be one of these tell-all books, but just explain how he went through his pro football life from when he was a kid growing up in Salem, Illinois, to his days at Tulsa University, his playing days with the Steelers in the 50s, and then going on to Canada and Calgary as a general manager in the Canadian League, then down to Minnesota and the Bears in Chicago, and then ultimately with the Saints in New Orleans. So, and we've got 7 award-winning writers that all contributed chapters, including our friend Brian L.E. Walsh, and Will McDonough, the late Will McDonough, who passed away recently, you may know, Jack Clary, Gordon Forbes, and several others who all contributed chapters. So we think it's a nice piece of work. Plus, it's going for the NFL Alumni Dire Need Fund. Some of the proceeds will go to that. Plus, we're trying to work with LSU Cancer Research. Dad has a chair, the Jim Finks Chair, in his name. So we hope to do well enough to be able to contribute to those charities, William.
Well, I tell you what, I had the pleasure of meeting your father on and off throughout his career in New Orleans, and I do remember reading about his career from the back of the various trading cards he got from his playing days with the Steelers. And I do remember, of course, he went to Tulsa University. Now, at that time, was the head coach Monk Simmons?
I believe it was, and there was one other gentleman who was a coach. I think I want to say Henry Franca.
Okay.
And but he played football and baseball and basketball at Tulsa, and they went to a couple of bowl games back there. I think they went to I believe they called it the Sun Bowl, and had some pretty good players. And then he was drafted 12th round by the Steelers in 1949, and that's when his pro career began. And you have those very valuable Jim Finks football cards, I'm sure.
Oh yes, we got them.
$3 worth, about right?
That's the first one cost me $3. When he became more famous as a GM, then the price gradually went up. But that's the price of success sometimes.
You're not going to be a millionaire collecting Jim Finks football cards, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Well, it's $1 million worth of memories. I know that.
Oh yeah.
Now, one interesting thing, the most fascinating thing about your father when I read about it, and I think I talked to him about it one time, that long before Deion Sanders and some of these other ball players tried to be two-sport pro players, your father, if my memory is right, was a catcher with the Cincinnati Reds minor leagues.
You're right, William, exactly. Your memory's just fine. He signed 2 contracts, one with the Steelers and one with Cincinnati Reds. And the agreement he had was that he could finish the baseball season, which would finish up in, I guess, late August back then. But this was minor league AAA or AA with the Reds. And the agreement he had with Art Rooney of the Steelers was he could finish the baseball season up, then report for a Steelers training camp in September. And he did that for about 2 or 3 years. It was a pretty good third baseman catcher, actually. And Art Rooney actually thought he had a better chance of making it big in Major League Baseball than football, because as you might recall, the Steelers teams Dad played for back in the 50s weren't exactly the Steel Curtain Steelers.
Right.
But you're right, he did, and finally it got to be too much, and he figured he had a better shot at football, so he gave up baseball and stayed with the Steelers.
But yet, I believe it was the 7 years he played with the Steelers that didn't he make it to the Pro Bowl 3 times?
He made it once.
Okay, once.
He made it in 1952, which was actually his there in Pittsburgh for so many years, and well, the rest of the league was, using the T formation for passing. The game was getting opened up a lot more, and people like Otto Graham and Norm Van Brocklin and so forth were excellent T formation passers, so they went to the T formation. He took 20 TD passes that year and went to the Pro Bowl.
Well, back in 1989, there was a gentleman who used to do radio in New Orleans by the name of Ed Clancy, and the first radio appearance I ever did in my life was with him, and he asked me about your father and what I knew of his career. The first thing that came to my mind, which I really thought is one of the more interesting games in NFL history, I think it was back in 1951 when he quarterbacked the Steelers. They had a huge upset over the New York Giants, 63-7. And in that game, he had quite a few touchdown passes, and I think both of the Giants quarterbacks got knocked out, and Tom Landry, of all people, had to be the Giants quarterback. And along in that game, because I believe the coach of the Giants was named Steve Owen, and the umbrella defense is what they used to use, and the Steelers that day ripped them apart. I guess you probably weren't around when that game was played, right?
If you said 1951, I wasn't born yet.
Okay.
So I wasn't there. As a matter of fact, I was only 5 years old, so I didn't remember any of the games at Pittsburgh and Ford Field. But you're right about that Giants game. Pittsburgh beat them actually 63-7. Dad had a big day throwing the ball, and Landry was the quarterback, and he'd never played quarterback before.
And I was going to say another interesting note. One thing I learned about your father last year, which a lot of the listeners I think will be interested in, there is a gentleman who, of course, has been a long-time broadcaster for CBS and Fox, Pat Summerall. And the only touchdown of his entire NFL career was an interception thrown by your father.
And Pat told me the story, and we mentioned it in the book. And of course, we want to tell the listeners where they can get the book also, William, before we're through. But Pat was at the time playing defensive end for the Chicago Cardinals, and he was playing defensive end, and Dad was the Steelers quarterback. Dad dropped back to throw a pass, and Summerall peeled back to react to the ball, and somehow Dad's pass hit Pat on the top of his helmet, bounced up in the air. He caught it and ran all the way for a touchdown. It was the only touchdown of Pat Summerall's career. And as you know, he's a great kicker for the Giants and the Cardinals. But, yeah, it was kind of unusual.
And, of course, your father's playing career lasted through 55, and a pretty famous name that was his backup at Pittsburgh was Ted Marchibroda.
Ted was there. I believe he joined the team in 51 from St. Bonaventure, or the University of Detroit, I guess it was. And Ted backed him up, and, of course, in 1955, the Steelers brought in a young man you may have heard by the name of Johnny Unitas.
Right.
And Johnny was, at that time, pretty much the fourth-string quarterback. The coach at the time at Pittsburgh, Walt Kiesling, really didn't think much of him, which was, of course, a mistake. As you know, Johnny went on to greatness in the Hall of Fame. And, of course, but as young kids growing up in our household, Dad would tell us that he beat out Johnny Unitas. When in reality, Johnny really didn't have a chance. He was a young guy, and he had a lot to learn. And of course, yeah, he passed away recently.
Right, and he acquired an amazing quarterback. And Ro Brown, who's been a reporter in New Orleans for years, also mentioned that story to me. And he said that you could always tell when you brought up the story, when you brought up the story to Mr. Finks, he always had that little gleam in his eye saying, "Yeah, I beat out Johnny U."
Sure he did.
Well, then, of course, in 1956, for 1 year, your father came in as an assistant under at Notre Dame University. And tell everybody a story about his good relationship he had with that year's Heisman Trophy winner, Paul Hornung.
Well, Paul was a senior, I believe, in 1956 at Notre Dame. Terry Brennan was the head coach, and Dad was brought into Notre Dame to coach the offense. And as you mentioned, Paul went on to win the Heisman Trophy that year, and Dad kept up a great friendship with Paul for many years after that. And Dad hired him to be the radio color commentator for the Vikings when we were up there, and later with the Chicago Bears. And Dad would always tell Paul that it was his coaching that helped him win the Heisman. And Paul would say, "Sure, but what about the rest of the team? We were 2-8 that year." So Paul was the only, I believe, one of the only Heisman winners to come from a losing team. I don't think you'll see that happen again today.
Nah, I doubt there's too much mass media following that trophy now.
Got that right.
Well, then it was 1 year at Notre Dame, and I believe in 57 he went up to Calgary at the Stampeders of the CFL. Now, One I read in the paper, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was that I believe your father went up there to be an assistant coach, but that the previous GM had resigned, and since he was the lowest tenured coach of Calgary, they elevated to him the GM?
That's not exactly correct, William. What happened, Dad thought, as you said, he was going up to coach in Calgary, but actually he ended up being the quarterback. And a lot of NFL guys were going up there because the CFL was actually paying better salaries than the NFL at that time. And the story was that after one game, Dad had broken some ribs and wasn't playing, and he was on the DL. Calgary lost a real tough game at Saskatchewan, and the general manager at the time, after the game, took a swing at one of the players who he thought had blown the game for him. So the owner was Red Dutton, and they ended up firing this gentleman, and then they put Dad in as interim general manager, and then later as full-time general manager, and that's where his executive career took off. So he kind of got into it on a fluke deal.
Wow, and then, of course, he spent many good seasons up there, and I don't exactly remember, but was Vic Schwenk the head coach at the time up there?
In Calgary?
Yeah.
No, actually it was Otis Douglas, who had played for the Eagles, and who was from William and Mary. And then Otis quit, and they brought in Steve Owen, coincidentally, who was the New York Giants coach you talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And then the last coach up there after Steve left was Bobby Dobbs, who was a player at Tulsa and at the Army. So, and then going down to Minnesota from there, Norm Van Brocken was the coach at the time, and Norm quit. And Dad hired Bud Grant, who he had known from the years in Canada, where, of course, Bud was in Winnipeg, and now he's in the Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, Minnesota, so many great teams that he helped build up there starting, I believe it was in 1967. I tell you what, Minnesota was a very tough place to play for visiting teams, that cold weather, especially in November and December and January. And the foundation your father put together, along with Bud Grant, of course, helped them go to Super Bowl IV, which was, by the way, in New Orleans against the Chiefs.
And you know who the ball boy was on the Vikings sideline for that game?
Let me guess. Was it you?
You're talking to him.
All right.
And that was that's something you'll never forget. That was obviously the first Super Bowl the Vikings had gone to, the first I'd ever been to. And the Vikings were 13-point favorites over Coach Hank Stram's KC Chiefs. And that was a devastating loss. As you know, Kansas City won pretty handily, 23-7, on Stram's 65 toss power trap play. Mm-hmm. And but that was a tough loss to take because you know, the NFL was still pretty much perceived as the superior league. But what that did with the Chiefs in the previous year when the Jets beat Baltimore in Joe Namath's game, that really elevated the AFL to being equals of the NFL. And now those two teams really proved it. Now that's what the case is today. So.
Well, and of course, Minnesota stayed a very powerful team for many years, including after your father left. And I guess it was around '74 that he joined owner George Halas with the Chicago Bears.
He actually was hired by the Bears, William, by George Muggs Halas Jr. And they had a pretty good relationship, known each other for quite a while. And Muggs had figured that he ought to bring in a full-time football guy because Muggs was involved more with league and other matters than the day-to-day operation of running the team. So Dad went down there in September of '74, and the Bears had been struggling. They had about 5 or 6 losing seasons in a row, and slowly, bit by bit, piece by piece, they built them up. Jack Pardee was the head coach who got him in the playoffs in '77, and then Neil Armstrong got him in one playoff game in '79. And eventually they went out to the Super Bowl in '85.
Now, of course, Mike Ditka became the Bears head coach in '82. Now, one outlet out in New Orleans, and of course, please correct me again if I'm wrong, but did your father step down because he felt the hiring of Mike Ditka maybe wasn't necessarily that good of a thing?
Well, I think, William, at the time, Dad really didn't know Ditka. And I believe what he said in his contract was that he had full authority to hire or fire the head coach. But of course, as you know, it was Papa Bear Halas' team, and he went ahead and did it. And I don't know if Dad would have hired Mike. You know, as you know, it worked out well for the Bears. A couple years later, they won Super Bowl 20 down in New Orleans. So, but yeah, that's part of the politics of the business. And but they ended up working together for, I believe Dad and Mike were together for a
course, I believe it was 21 out of those 22 Super Bowl starters your father had selected in the draft.
Well, I think there was two he wasn't involved in the selection. And one was William Refrigerator Perry, and the other was the linebacker Wilbur Marshall. But the other 20, you're right, he either drafted or signed as free agents. So it was a pretty good group.
Now, before he came to the Saints in '86, I'd love to know, how did your father go from the sport of football to help managing the Chicago Cubs in '84?
Well, he got to know quite a few people in Chicago. One of them was Andy McKenna, who ran a paper distribution company, and Andy was involved with the Chicago Tribune and of course, the Cubs. And Dad had left, and when it was August of '93, he left the Bears, and he actually went to work for a public relations firm in Chicago for a time, trying to take some time off and see what he wanted to do next. And Mr. McKenna called and admired his ability to run the organization. And they did for that 1 year in 1984. You might recall the Cubs won the NL East that year before losing in the playoffs to the Padres. And after that, he figured it was time to get back into football, and Mr. Benson called him, and the rest is history.
How exactly did Mr. Finks and Tom Benson first link up?
I think it was through Ed McCaskey, who's currently the chairman of the Bears. Mr. Benson had bought the team from John Maycomb Jr. back in '85, and I think Bum Phillips was the coach at the time, and I believe Bum left, and then Wade, his son, came in to coach. And I think Mr. Benson was looking for a full-time football guy to run the operation, and I believe he called Dad, and they got together and worked out an agreement, and there were some pretty good years there from '86 to '92.
Exactly. Now, of course, in '86, the first things a lot of fans will remember is that great draft that your father helped put together, and of course, the staff as well. Jim Dombrowski and Reuben Mays, Dalton Hilliard, Pat Swilling, Barry Word. Gil Faraday was drafted in '86, though he didn't play with the Saints until '90.
That's right.
Now, you add to that some of the USFL guys Coach Moore knew, including Antonio Gibson, and of course Bobby Hebert was with the Saints in '85. Then there was also Chuck Comiskey and Buford Jordan, countless USFL guys. Herbert Harris, I think, was another, and that was quite a foundation to start in '86, which eventually led to that first great winning season of '87.
Well, you're right, and you've left out two real fine USFL players, Mel Gray, the kick returner, and Von Johnson, old Meathead, the linebacker, and you put that group together with what the Saints already had. I mean, Ricky Jackson, Stan Brock, Hobie Brenner, the great kicker, the great Dane, Morton Anderson, and that group. And that was like an entire first-class draft yourself of all those USFL refugees. So it wasn't too long after that, as you know, in '87 when they went 12-3 and got into the playoffs.
And, of course, the celebration in the city of New Orleans for the last 2 months of the regular season was overwhelming. People who really didn't even follow football before became Saints fans, and games were selling out. Excitement was everywhere, and leading into that first playoff game, ironically, against your father's old team, the Minnesota Vikings, there was just electricity everywhere. And I think the one dedication that I'm sure your father and everybody with the Saints appreciated was the fans who stayed for that entire game. I believe it was right after the 2-minute warning near the end of the game. Jerry Romig was the Superdome announcer, that's the game day announcer. He asked everybody, let's give the New Orleans Saints a standing ovation for this outstanding season. And it truly was. It was truly probably the most overwhelming things the fans could have ever expected.
Well, that the game obviously was a disappointment because the Vikings handled it pretty well. But I got to tell you this, the fans, Saints fans are the best anywhere. I mean, they're passionate about the game. If you bring a winning team that gives effort Sunday after Sunday, they're going to be behind you. And every time I go to a game at the Dome, I was so impressed with the fans and the knowledge of the game.
Oh, yes, and of course, 88, the remaining of the tenure, he was here, 88 through the 92 seasons. The Saints went on to 3 more playoff games, though unfortunately none of them turned out into victories. In Thibodeau, we're part of Lafourche Parish, and one of the more favorite players that came out of Lafourche Parish for the Saints was Bobby Hebert, a fine quarterback who's pretty rangy, and he wound up being the second all-time passer in team history. And what some fans are going to remember was the contract situation he had with the Saints in '90 and '93.
Going back to 1990, the Saints had a 9-7 season in '89, and they were eliminated from the playoffs with three weeks left to go. Now, since I was an outsider and I wasn't on the inside like your father was, what exactly happened? Why was there a breakdown between the Saints and Bobby Aver over the contract going into '90?
I wish I knew, William. I'll tell you one thing about Dad is that, business was business. I mean, what he did with contract negotiations with players or front office people, that was strictly none of my business. All I knew is what I read. And there's obviously some money differences that players and management have. But you mentioned Bobby, and I mentioned I got a chance to meet him back in 2000 at the Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame in Natchitoches when Bobby was inducted, and so was Dad, and I went over there to represent him. We had a nice talk about it, and there's no hard feelings, and Bobby basically just said, that's just the business of pro football, and that's really what it is. I mean, Bobby has his position to defend, and Dad does on the management side of the fence. Sometimes you don't see eye to eye, but you just try to do the best to work it out.
Very true. Now, let's get to that. You mentioned the Hall of Fame in 2000, inducted into Louisiana Sports Hall of Fame, and of course, I'm sure another very respected honor your father got was 1994, though it was posthumously, was inducted into the Saints Hall of Fame in Kenner. And also, I believe, and help me out with my memory, it might have been a little bit before or after that, your father also received an award from the Touchdown Club, got the annual Vince Lombardi Award for Outstanding Lifetime Achievement in Football.
Right. Actually, it was the Pete Rozelle Award, William, that the New Orleans Touchdown Club put on there, and I flew back to New Orleans, and Ed McCaskey, the Bears, and Don Weiss, a longtime NFL executive, were there, and of course this was it's the kickoff Saints luncheon to the season. So he was very honored to get those awards, and I'm sure he's honored to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame as well as the Saints Hall of Fame.
Now, in 1995, I had the chance through ESPN2 to see the induction ceremonies that day that you gave on behalf of your father, and I could tell by the tone of your voice that not only was it a very overwhelming experience to have to present your father, but I could tell that you and your family just had a tremendous appreciation for everything that the Pro Football Hall of Fame did, and I think without a doubt it was probably an excellent finish to your father's long-standing career.
Well, it's a great weekend. I don't know if you've had a chance to go back there for Hall of Fame weekend, but it's just terrific, and they do such a great job for all the inductees and the families. And when you go out up to the podium and they introduce you, and you're looking at 20,000 people and television cameras and photographers around, you can be pretty overwhelming. But we got through that okay, and of course that was the class 95 with Kellen Winslow, Steve Largent, Henry Jordan, and Leroy Selman along with Dad. So it's something we'll definitely never forget, our family.
And of course, every year Kenny Trahan with the Saints Hall of Fame has the annual Alumni Weekend, and every time we go out there, we always have so many great memories to talk about. And now this past October, the annual induction included Coach Jim Mora, and I think without a doubt your father and him must have got along very well here.
I think they did. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I know that my mom, Maxine, and Jim's wife, Connie Mora, were friends, and whenever we see their kids, we always had a good time. They're a great group, and of course, Jim Sr. is no longer in coaching, but Junior Mora is still with the 49ers, I believe. I don't know if they're going to keep him, the new coach there, Dennis Erickson, but Jim Jr. is certainly a capable defensive coordinator.
Now, I feel rather regretful if I didn't ask you this. We at the same Hall of Fame induction, they also honored Frank Warren, who sadly passed away a few weeks later. What are your memories of Frank Warren?
I remember as a hell of a defensive tackle or defensive end. He's a real fine player. And the funny thing, you mentioned that, I don't know if you watched the HBO special, Frank Gumbel's show.
Right.
He did a special on Frank, and the whole concept of the story was NFL linemen and how big they're getting today. 300 pounds is just like average weight. And sadly, Frank passed away shortly after that. So I remember he was a good guy and a real fine football player. I didn't get to know him very well, but I'm sure the whole Saints family is sad by that.
Oh, yes, indeed. And quite a remarkable football player was Frank Warren. Well, we got to let all of our wonderful listeners now know, of course, about your father's book. It's been a pleasure. The Jim Finks story. Please tell everybody where they can write and how much the cost is for the book.
Well, what we're doing, William, we appreciate you mentioning that. Some of the proceeds for this are going to go to the NFL Alumni Dire Fund Need, or Dire Need Fund, I should say. And as well, we're trying to get LSU Cancer Research. Dad has a Jim Finks Chair for Cancer Research in his name at LSU, and if it does well, then those charities will definitely benefit. The one place they can write to is, if you got a pencil, it's AMO Productions. And that's P.O. Box 9134, Newport Beach, California. And it's 92658. And the cost of the book is $30.95, and we're taking checks only, and that includes shipping and handling. And I just got some good news from the NFL alumni. They're going to post the book up on their website later this week or early next week. And the website is nflala.org. And they'll be able to click on that and be able to order the book. And we should have the book very shortly here in about 3 to 4 weeks.
Oh, I was going to say, it sounds wonderful, and we've been promoting the book the last couple of days here at the station, and we'll continue to do so, for a good while, because Mr. Finks meant so much to people in our area, and of course, as we speak, Thibodaux is now the home of Saints training camp.
That's right.
And people, just like I said, we've had it now since 2000. Of course, when your father was there, I believe camp initially was in Hammond before it moved to La Crosse.
It was in Hammond, and the ironic story about that, and Brian L.E. Walsh mentioned it in his chapter titled The Big Easy. After the Saints moved to La Crosse, Wisconsin, they thought they were going to a cooler climate. Well, as it turned out, it was the hottest summer in 50 years in Wisconsin. It was probably cooler down in Hammond. Anyway, that's showbiz.
Oh, exactly. And, of course, my personal favorite story out of Hammond, and I've told this to the listeners before, was, of course, in 1987, the Saints' first-round pick, you would remember, was Sean Knight.
Right.
Now, Sean, of course, didn't pan out very well as a defensive lineman.
Not at all.
Out of, I believe, Brigham University.
That's right.
And what had happened, and I got this from one of the players, that he was holding out and basically held out for all of camp. And one day in the middle of that hot sun at Strawberry Stadium in Hammond there, here the players sweating their butt off trying to get in shape for the season, and about midway through practice, somebody walks through the side gate of the stadium, and it's Sean Knight wearing shorts, eating an ice cream cone.
Oh.
And he decided he was going to go walk towards the bench and stand behind Carl Smith. Well, apparently Coach Morris saw that after a few minutes, and he got so upset he actually blew the whistle, stopped practice, and chased Sean Knight out of the stadium and told him not to come back until he was ready to practice.
I'm not a bit surprised. I don't think Coach Morris ever appreciated his players eating ice cream cones.
Right. And,
Practice.
oh, I'm willing to say that's a pretty sound statement to make. Well, listen, everybody out here in the Thibodaux area greatly appreciates your time, and hopefully you'll get a lot of sales from our listeners on this book. Goes to two great charities, and, well, like I said, Mr. Finks did a lot for New Orleans, and I think all of us are still to this day indebted for all the great things your father did, and we really appreciate your time.
We appreciate that, William, and I look forward to talking to you again.